Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly through the damp corridors of a medieval chapel. The air smells of beeswax candles, damp stone, and the faint sharpness of old incense. You can almost feel the chill crawling up your sleeves as you tiptoe closer to the small gathering huddled near the altar. A bride and groom stand shoulder to shoulder, their eyes wide and a little uncertain. They're about to whisper vows in Latin words they can barely pronounce, let alone comprehend fully. It's a world where marriages are less about fluttering hearts and more about alliances, property, and the social ladder you were born into. You probably won't survive this timeline without at least 3 awkward family negotiations over your future. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you re-listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle closer, the flagstones cold beneath your thin shoes. The priest raises a hand, solemn and a touch impatient, because there are 2 more couples scheduled to marry before noon. In medieval Europe, weddings are rarely private affairs. Your neighbors, your second cousin twice removed, the steward from the manor house, they're all crammed in here to witness you becoming one flesh. And to be sure, the church gets its due fee. The bride's gown is dyed with woad, giving it a dusky blue hue that was once believed to symbolize purity and a certain stiff-lipped piety. You notice her veil is trimmed with cheap imported lace, a sign her family scrimped and traded for months to afford even this modest luxury. Historians still argue whether the color blue was more about Marian symbolism or simply practical dyeing traditions. Either way, it looks striking against the gloom. Beside her, the groom fidgets with the carved bone ring he's about to place on her finger. If you squint, you can see it etched with a crude pair of clasped hands, some local craftsman's best attempt at illustrating faith and loyalty. But everyone here knows the real glue is the dowry. This union has been negotiated, renegotiated, and finally sealed with the exchange of a tidy parcel of land, 2 goats, and an optimistic promise that no one will challenge the property boundaries come harvest. You watch the priest's lips move in a practiced rhythm. His Latin incantation is as familiar to him as his morning porridge. He asks if anyone objects to this marriage, and the silence that follows is a collective exhale. No scandal today, anyway. Behind you, a baby begins to fuss. You can almost feel the collective irritation ripple through the crowd, because weddings are serious business. They are legal contracts as much as spiritual ones. The idea that marriage is purely about love would have sounded ridiculous to most of these villagers. Instead, it's a binding promise to keep property consolidated, families allied, and hopefully the next generation safely legitimate. Outside the chapel, the sky is a flat, pewter-gray, threatening drizzle. A few men shuffle near the doorway, whispering about whether the groom's father will hold up his end of the bargain and pay the final installment of the dowry. One of them clucks his tongue and mutters that, in some places, you can marry simply by agreeing verbally in front of witnesses, no priest required. That's true. It's called hand-fasting, and though the church hates it, the custom persists in remote corners. Quirky as it sounds, those marriages were often considered valid if you were bold enough to claim them. But here, in this respectable chapel, the proper rites are unfolding. The couple kneels as the priest murmurs a blessing for fertility. prosperity and God's mercy in the difficult years ahead. You notice a flicker of worry cross the bride's face. She's young, barely 15, and she's heard stories of childbirth that sound more like battlefield carnage than domestic bliss. Someone behind you mentions that Saint Margaret is the patron saint of expectant mothers, and you file that away just in case you ever need a little extra help surviving medieval motherhood. The final prayers are said. The ring slides onto the bride's shaking finger, and the priest makes the sign of the cross over their bowed heads. A sigh ripples through the congregation, part relief, part boredom. Another alliance sealed, another family's future recalibrated. You catch the bride's eye for a moment, and in that glance you see it all: the fear, the hope, the dull resignation. And just like that, you are ushered out into the courtyard. The cold drizzle has started, and everyone huddles under cloaks and makeshift awnings. Someone produces a small basket of sugared almonds, a luxury reserved for significant occasions. You pop one into your mouth and discover it tastes mostly like disappointment and stale honey, but it's the thought that counts. As you watch the families shake hands and quietly recalculate their standings, you can't help noticing that even the simplest ceremony is layered with power, expectation, and the constant hum of obligation. This was only the beginning, the prelude to a life measured in harvests, childbirths, and the uneasy balance of keeping peace between rival clans. You step back from the chapel door and wrap your cloak tighter around your shoulders. In the medieval world, weddings were as inevitable as rain and just as likely to leave you damp, cold, and wondering what you'd gotten yourself into. You step away from the drizzle, but the murmur of voices follows you down the uneven path toward the village green. Today isn't just a wedding, it's the culmination of a marriage market. A season of negotiations that have been going on for months or even years. You drift among the clusters of people, noting how everyone seems to have an opinion about what the bride was worth and whether the groom's family overpaid. In medieval Europe, marriage is a transaction so public and intricate that you can almost hear the ledger pages rustling in everyone's heads. You watch a group of men from the bride's kin unroll a small parchment, listing everything she's bringing into the union. 1 cow, 4 blankets, a brass pot, 2 silver spoons. Historians still argue whether these lists were legally binding contracts or simply social pressure made permanent on parchment. Either way, it's clear the family has staked its future on this arrangement. Standing near a wagon, a woman in a patched linen dress is haggling with her brother about whether the girl's dowry was too meager. She's a good weaver, the woman insists, worth more than 2 goats. Her brother shrugs, the way men often do when the math of marrying off a daughter starts to look suspiciously like a losing investment. You notice the bride herself off to the side, sitting on a barrel and studying her feet. No one's asking her what she thinks. Her role here is to be amiable, modest, and preferably silent. A donkey brays nearby, as if seconding the absurdity of it all. And yet, for all its unromantic calculus, the marriage market keeps the village functioning. You trail behind a pair of merchants who have traveled from 2 towns over to witness this union. They murmur about alliances, how a wedding can open up trade routes, smooth over feuds, or consolidate grazing rights. To your modern ears, it feels cold and transactional, but to them, it's simply survival. One older woman catches you looking and offers a knowing grin. Better a good match than a love match, she says. Love don't put bread on the table. You're about to reply, when you realize she's absolutely serious. You pass by a smaller gathering of children playing marriage. They tie lengths of string around their wrists and solemnly announce their husband and wife. Even in play, they mimic the rituals, offering imaginary coins, bowing to invisible parents, promising to feed their goats together. You can almost hear the future echoing. More contracts, more negotiations, more measured alliances. Nearby, a minor knight adjusts the heavy clasp of his cloak and surveys the scene. His eyes flicker over the families like a farmer checking the ripeness of fruit. He's here to see which daughters are coming of age, which dowries look promising, which alliances might fortify his dwindling fortune. A few years from now, he'll be haggling over a parchment, just like the one you saw earlier. A young scribe stands ready to record any final agreements. His ink-stained fingers tremble in the cold, but he never drops his pen. Every commitment must be witnessed and transcribed. Without that record, disputes can drag on for decades. Historians still argue whether the surge in written contracts in the late Middle Ages was driven by genuine legal necessity or simply by a rising obsession with documenting every scrap of property and promise. You wander past the wagons again, where dowry goods are being inventoried. You see bolts of coarse wool, a chipped chest carved with clumsy floral patterns, and a small casket of silver coins. These tokens might look humble, but they could mean the difference between solvency and ruin for a middling household. One woman is quietly crying. You're not sure if she's the bride's mother or an aunt, but her tears look as if they've been waiting to fall for weeks. She dabs at her cheeks with a frayed kerchief, glancing around as though embarrassed to be the only one showing emotion. It's not that no one cares. It's just that feelings don't matter as much as alliances do. A skinny youth with bad teeth sidles up to you, lowering his voice conspiratorially. They say the groom's father cheated to other families before, promised fine land and gave them swamp. You raise an eyebrow, and he nods. Watch and see someone else going to ride out there and measure every rod of dirt before the week is out. And here your quirky tidbit. Some regions required a wedding feast to prove the marriage's legitimacy. If you didn't throw a decent party, people might whisper that the union wasn't valid. Imagine marrying someone and then being forced to foot the bill for a feast just to hush the gossip mill. You drift toward the bride again as she's gently led away to prepare for the handfasting. Her eyes dart to her family's bundle of dowry goods, tangible proof that her life, her worth, and her destiny are all contained in those carefully counted objects. She doesn't weep. Instead, she lifts her chin and tries to look brave. And so you follow her up the narrow lane, past neighbors calculating in murmured sums. Through a world where a marriage is never just a promise between two souls. It's a public spectacle, a market transaction, and an unspoken guarantee that, at least for a while, nobody goes hungry. You find yourself walking behind the bride as she escorted along a muddy track toward the small wooden platform hastily built for the handfasting. The boards creak underfoot, and the air smells of damp straw and the faint tang of the tannery downwind. Everyone is crowding in to see the ritual. This is the moment when words and gestures will officially bind two families together, and nobody wants to miss it. Handfasting isn't exactly the same as the church ceremony you witnessed earlier. It's older, a folk custom with roots that stretch back into the murky centuries when Christianity was still elbowing out pagan traditions. You watch as the couple stands facing each other, hands joined palm to palm, and a narrow strip of cloth is wound around their wrists in a loose knot. Some call this the tying of the knot, which is probably more literal here than you'd prefer. Historians still argue whether fasting was meant to be a temporary betrothal like an engagement with benefits or a full marriage in its own right. In some villages, it counted as legally binding if there were enough witnesses and everyone agreed it happened. In others, it was merely a public promise to marry later in the church. But here, on this chilly afternoon, it's both spectacle and insurance policy. You can feel the hush settle over the crowd. The officiant, a grizzled reeve who smells strongly of ale and wet wool, raises a hand for silence. He recites the familiar words that the couple swear by God and all his saints, to keep faith with one another, to share burdens and profits, to maintain the household together. It sounds so simple when he says it, but you can almost see the invisible ledger in everyone's mind, calculating what these promises are really worth. The bride's fingers twitch under the binding cloth. She's wearing a small posy of rosemary pinned to her sleeve, believed to bring remembrance and loyalty. Your eye catches a glint of something tucked in among the herbs, and you realize it's a tiny token piece of carved jet shaped like a heart. That detail is your quirky tidbit. Some betrothed couples exchanged little talismans or charms, believing these tokens would bind their affections, or at least serve as a visible declaration of intent. As the final words are spoken, the reeve spits on his palm and clasps the groom's freehand, crude but widely accepted way of sealing any agreement. You feel a ripple of discomfort at the thought of that gesture making or breaking your future, but nobody here bats an eye. This is how it's always been done, and tradition is a heavy yoke. A pair of old women near you begin speculating about whether the union will last. He looks shifty, one mutters, and her people are known for hoarding grain. The other sniffs. As long as the dowry's paid, it's none of our business. You try not to smile. Even centuries later, the same gossipy voices still show up at every wedding. When the cloth is untied, the bride looks almost dazed. A little thrill passes through the crowd. This ceremony has given her new status. She's no longer simply a daughter. She's the property, in a manner of speaking, of a different household. You note how the older women glance at her with a mix of pity and approval. The couple is guided to a trestle table set up under a sagging canopy. Here, a scribe unrolls a narrow strip of parchment and begins to record names, parentage, and the date. This moment will be written down as evidence because, in medieval life, any agreement worth making is worth recording, preferably twice. The bride's father steps forward to press a small coin into the officiant's palm. You realize it, partly a thank you, and partly a subtle bribe to ensure the record is favorable. This was a common enough practice that local priests and reeves often earned a tidy supplementary income from wedding fees, blessings, and the occasional quiet adjustment to a family's standing. Just behind you, a boy no older than 12 is carrying a basket of favors, small scraps of woven ribbon and dried flowers. He hands one to you with an earnest nod. You twirl it between your fingers, feeling the rough threads and wondering what kind of future the bride imagines for herself. Does she expect love to grow from this arrangement, or is she already resigned to managing a household and keeping the accounts straight? Your gaze drifts across the faces of the spectators, the hopeful, the envious, the quietly skeptical. Marriage isn't an isolated moment. it's a performance, a declaration of ambition, of prudence, of social worth. The families stand shoulder to shoulder, masking their calculations behind polite smiles. A few feet away, the groom is trying to look confident. He shifts from foot to foot, cheeks flushing whenever anyone makes eye contact. You can help noticing that his cloak is frayed at the hem, a subtle sign that his family, as fortunes, might not be as secure as they like everyone to believe. But in this ritual, appearances are everything. A good show can smooth over a lot of deficiencies. As the witnesses file past to leave their marks on the record, you realize that hand fasting isn't just an old custom, it's a vivid, unfiltered glimpse of medieval priorities. The binding of hands, the exchange of small tokens, the solemn recitation of obligations, these were the scaffolding that held society together. You suspect that many couples went home afterward, feeling more relieved than elated. By the time the last witness scrawls a shaky X on the parchment, dusk has settled. A bell tolls in the distance, calling everyone to the evening meal. You take a final look at the newly joined couple as they step carefully down from the platform. Their hands no longer bound, but their futures inextricably entwined. And you follow them back down the path, your feet crunching over last year's withered rushes, thinking how sometimes the simplest gestures, a piece of cloth, a clasp of hands, can carry the heaviest consequences. You follow the bride and groom back along the trampled path, where the last pink streaks of daylight have faded into a deep, uneasy blue. Lanterns flicker in the hands of a few onlookers who aren't quite ready to go home, their flames casting jittery shadows across the church's heavy wooden door. The ceremony might be over, but in medieval Europe, marriage isn't fully official without the church's blessing. You trail behind the couple as they re-ushered back inside for the more solemn and legally binding part of their union. Inside the nave, it's colder than you remember. The damp stone seems to suck every trace of warmth out of your skin. You huddle against a pillar, watching the priest bustle about, arranging the chalice and muttering under his breath. He looks tired, as if he's performed this same ritual dozens of times already this month, and he probably has. In a society where property and piety are tangled together, matrimony isn't simply a sacrament, it's a moral safeguard. The priest clears his throat and raises his hands. You notice the way everyone shifts uncomfortably as he begins to lecture on the purpose of marriage: to avoid the sin of fornication, to populate the kingdom with lawful heirs, and to bind two souls in a chaste union that hopefully pleases God. Not quite the romance novel you were hoping for. Historians still argue whether these sermons were meant to shame young couples or simply to remind them that their private desires were always, somehow, the church's business. As the priest drones on, you look up at the vaulted ceiling. Faint traces of painted saints peer down from the beams, their faces faded and water-stained. You imagine what it would feel like to stand here in the flickering light, knowing that every vow you uttered would be recorded in a ledger and, if necessary, read back to you in the event of a dispute. The bride's eyes are locked on the altar. Her veil drapes over her shoulders, and the candlelight catches the edge of her headdress, a narrow circlet of brass that pinches her scalp if she moves too quickly. She's trying to stay still, trying to look composed, because everyone is watching to see if she betrays any sign of hesitation. When the priest finally reaches the vows themselves, the bride and groom clasp hands again. This time, their palms are cold and clammy. The priest recites the familiar words in Latin words that sound almost like a chant, and the couple stumbles through their responses. You catch the groom glancing at the priest for reassurance after every phrase. This is the moment that truly matters. Without these sanctioned vows, the union would be considered irregular. You overhear a merchant whisper to his wife that a marriage performed without the church's approval could be challenged at any time, especially if someone decided to contest an inheritance. That's your mainstream historical factunder canon law. Clandestine or unblessed unions could be declared invalid, leaving children technically illegitimate and property in limbo. As the vows end, the priest solemnly pronounces them man and wife. The words are final, heavy, and a little anticlimactic. There's no cheering, no applause, just the creak of benches as witnesses rise, and the soft rustle of skirts as everyone prepares to leave. One elderly woman near you crosses herself, then mutters that the couple will need to keep a clean household or risk God's displeasure. You almost want to ask her what clean means, but you suspect the answer is both literal and moral. The priest dips his thumb in a small pot of holy oil and draws a cross on the couple's foreheads. This, he says, is a sign that God's grace will protect them from temptation and misfortune. You note, with a little smile, that the oil doesn't seem to soothe the groom's anxious expression. He looks ready to bolt, as if he's just realized the enormity of what he's agreed to. A small bell chimes, signaling the end of the rite. As everyone shuffles toward the door, you catch sight of a modest wooden coffer tucked behind the altar. That's where the parish records are kept, parchments inscribed with every marriage, baptism, and burial in this corner of the kingdom. The scribe will add a new entry tonight, noting the names, dowry details, and witnesses. If disputes ever arise, they often do. These records will be the final word. Near the door, a few children are playing with scraps of wax fallen from the candles, oblivious to the gravity of the occasion. One boy holds up a misshapen lump that he insists is a tiny priest. Another child scolds him for mocking holy things. You realize that even in the Middle Ages, kids could be both irreverent and superstitious in the same breath. The bride's mother lingers by the threshold, pressing a small wooden charm into her daughter's palm. You strain to see it, a carved disc etched with a crude fish that was believed to symbolize abundance and divine blessing, a talisman to protect the household from the twin scourges of hunger and disease. Your quirky tidbit for the night. Some parishes tolerated little charms like this if they were Christianized, but others denounced them as lingering pagan nonsense. Finally, the couple steps over the threshold to gather an old, symbolic gesture that marks the passage from single life into shared obligation. The priest watches them go, already turning back to gather his things. For him, this is just one of dozens of unions he'll oversee this year. You step out behind them into the brisk evening. The church bells toll once more, and you can almost feel the collective relief. The contract is sealed. The vows are spoken. The marriage is indisputable. For better or worse, and in this century, it's often worse, they are now one. You follow the newly minted husband and wife as they cross the darkening square, their footsteps soft in the mud. A few stragglers wave half-heartedly before hurrying home, eager to warm themselves by the hearth and whisper about the ceremony over mugs of weak ale. But tonight isn't over yet, not for this couple, and certainly not for you, because you're about to witness something on a much grander scale, a noble wedding. Where the peasant ceremony was plain and practical, noble nuptials are theatrical, indulgent, and ostentatious to a degree that would make a modern influencer blush. You pass through the village gate and up a winding lane toward the manor house, where lamplight gleams from every window and the air smells of roasting meat and spiced wine. Inside, the great hall is already buzzing. Tapestries depicting improbable hunting scenes, stags bigger than oxen, dogs the size of horses flutter in the draught. A dozen servants scurry about, laying trenchers, filling jugs, and arranging tableware polished so bright it glints in the torchlight. You weave between them, trying not to trip over baskets of bread or a sleepy hound sprawled across the flagstones. At the far end of the hall, the high table groans under the weight of display platters, glazed pastries shaped like swans, stuffed pike garnished with fennel capons, fattened on almonds. One roast boar has been reassembled with gilded tusks and a sprig of rosemary tucked in its jaws, as though it died mid-feast. Historians still argue whether such elaborate dishes were really eaten or simply intended to show off wealth. Judging by the wide eyes of the guests, the spectacle is just as important as the flavor. The bride is seated on a carved chair beside her new husband, a young lord whose embroidered tunic probably cost more than most villagers will earn in their lives. Her gown gleams with silk panels and seed pearls sewn in intricate loops that catch the firelight. A jeweled circlet holds her veil in place, and every time she shifts her head, it flashes like a beacon announcing her family's prosperity. Your mainstream historical fact here. Noble weddings weren't just private contracts, they were vital political events. These unions sealed treaties, transferred fiefs, and reshuffled loyalties between powerful families. The bride might be little more than a polite pawn in a decades-long game of chess. Someone nearby mentions that the bride's dowry included not only land and coin, but also the promise of 50 armed men to defend her husband's borders. You glance at her delicate hands folded in her lap and imagine the hidden weight behind that gentle posture. A hush falls as the seneschal strides to the middle of the hall, tapping the staff on the floor. He proclaims the official joining of the houses, rattling off their pedigrees in a nasal drone that seems to last forever. You catch glimpses of the bride's face, sometimes composed, sometimes flickering with something like dread. Servants begin circulating with flagons of Hippocras, a sweetened, spiced wine meant to warm the blood and loosen tongues. One lady-in-waiting leans in to offer you a cup. It's syrupy and cloying, but you force yourself to swallow it, because refusing hospitality here would be nearly unthinkable. Your attention drifts to a group of minstrels setting up near the hearth, their tuning fiddles and setting out hand drums, preparing to launch into the night's entertainment. You overhear a few guests speculating which songs will be played, perhaps ballads praising the couple's virtues, or ribald tunes to keep everyone awake until dawn. Your quirky tidbit. In some courts, it was fashionable to hire jesters to mimic the bride and groom in exaggerated pantomime, an unsettling spectacle that blurred the line between celebration and mockery. The seneschal finishes his speech at last. A collective sigh of relief ripples through the hall. Dishes arrive in waves. Stews spiced with saffron, eels stewed in ale, loaves stamped with each family's crest. You can't help noticing how the bride picks at her plate. You suspect she hasn't had a moment to breathe all day, much less to eat. You slip back along the trestle tables, listening as noble guests boast about their holdings, their alliances, their plans to marry off yet more sons and daughters. One night, his voice, slurred with wine, declares that a good marriage requires only 3 things: a profitable dowry, a fertile bride, and a God who doesn't ask too many questions. You wonder if he'll remember saying it in the morning. A hush falls again as a steward carries in a towering subtlety a sugar sculpture shaped like a castle with tiny marzipan figures arranged in neat ranks. It looks too delicate to eat, and you watch several guests crane forward, eager to see whether it will collapse under its own weight. You feel almost relieved when it doesn't. Eventually, the bride and groom rise. The crowd parts for them with murmured blessings and practiced bows. A priest steps forward to offer a final benediction, praising God for the fruitful union and praying for many heirs. You notice how the older matrons nod along, their eyes glimmering with calculation. A noble marriage isn't truly successful until it produces the next generation, and quickly. The couple retreats to the solar, leaving the hall to erupt into song and laughter. Someone starts a dance in the cleared space near the hearth, and you watch as bright skirts whirl and boots thump in time to the music. For a moment, it almost feels joyful, as though everyone has forgotten the undercurrents of politics and power. You slip outside into the cold, your ears still ringing with music. The manor windows blaze with light, but the night beyond them is vast and dark. You imagine the bride sitting upstairs, perhaps shedding her jeweled circlet, and wondering if this marriage will ever feel like her own choice. You draw your cloak around your shoulders and start back down the hill, the taste of Hippocras lingering on your tongue. In noble circles, weddings are grand performances, but behind the spectacle, the same old story hums quietly. Alliances forged, obligations bound, and individual hopes quietly set aside. You leave the echoing splendor of the manor behind, your boots squelching in the ruts carved by countless carts. By the time you reach the edge of the village again, the music has faded into a distant thrum. You follow a narrow track past the thatched roofs of simpler cottages, the air smelling of damp straw and wood smoke. Here, weddings are humbler, stripped of the silk and spectacle you just witnessed. Tonight, you're going to see what a peasant wedding looks like. And as you step into the low-beamed hall where the celebration is underway, you feel the contrast down to your bones. The air is thick with the scent of boiled barley and roasted turnips. A smoky rushlight flickers over rough wooden benches packed tight with neighbors, cousins, and anyone else who heard there would be food. The bride sits near the hearth, her gown a plain homespun dyed with madder root, a warm, rusty color that flatters her flushed cheeks. A wreath of dried flowers circles her head, modest, but no less symbolic than the gold circlets worn by noble women. Here, every scrap of decoration has been gathered with care, and you sense a quiet pride in the simple beauty of it all. A fiddler sets his bow against the strings and begins a tune that sounds like it's been passed from one generation to the next without ever needing to be written down. Children wriggle at the edges of the crowd, trying not to get stepped on as the adults raise cups of weak ale and shout blessings that double as thinly veiled advice. Your mainstream historical fact. In most medieval villages, weddings had to be performed publicly for the union to be considered valid. Even the poorest families scraped together witnesses because without them, questions of legitimacy could dog a marriage for years. You watch the groom's mother, her hands cracked from years of tending livestock, press a flat oatcake into the bride's hands. She murmurs something you can't hear, but the bride nods, her eyes bright. This exchange is part of the ceremony too, a quiet promise that the household's bread will be shared and the new wife welcomed. Someone pushes a clay cup into your hand. You sip, wincing at the sour tang of cheap cider. A young man leans over to whisper that, in some places, the couple would eat from the same loaf of bread to symbolize their unity. He grins, showing a gap where two teeth used to be. Or sometimes, he adds, they just break it over each other's heads and call it good luck. You're not entirely sure he's joking. A small group of women begins to sing in unison, voices rising above the fiddle. The melody is plain but sweet, and the lyrics are a blend of blessings and teasing, promises that the bride will have many children, that the groom will never stray too far from home, that the hens will always lay and the cows never dry up. Your quirky tidbit. Some villages had traditional songs so local that outsiders would be baffled by the references. Little time capsules of gossip, humor, and hope. The couple rises for their vows. No Latin here, just a clear, simple promise, spoken in the vernacular. You feel the hush settle over the hall as they clasp hands. There's no scribe, no parchment, but every person watching will remember these words. If anyone ever questions whether this marriage took place, a dozen voices will swear they saw it with their own eyes. Historians still argue whether this simplicity made peasant unions more fragile or more resilient. Some say the lack of formal paperwork led to disputes. Others believe the public nature of the promises made them harder to deny. As you watch the bride smile shyly at her new husband, you wonder if it's both true and not true, depending on the season, the harvest, and the strength of the community. When the vows end, there is no grand pronouncement. Instead, a loud cheer goes up, and someone bangs a wooden spoon on the table for emphasis. The couple looks relieved, more than anything like to people who have just finished a job that had to be done before the real work begins. The benches are pulled back to clear space for dancing. You find yourself pressed against the wall as the first carol begins. Peasant dances are robust affairs. Everyone linked in a circle, stamping and turning in time with the fiddle's rising tempo. The bride's wreath wobbles precariously with each step, and the groom's cheeks are red with embarrassment and exertion. A young woman near you claps her hands and calls out that no wedding is complete without the first loaf. A neighbor produces a small, dark loaf of rye bread wrapped in cloth. It's broken in half and shared among the dancers, a reminder that a marriage is as much about survival as celebration. Someone hands you another cup, this one filled with thin broth. You sip carefully, feeling the warmth spread through you. The hall smells of earth and sweat and something intangible belonging. For all its simplicity, this wedding feels no less important than the noble feast you witnessed earlier, maybe more so. Here, the stakes are smaller in scale, but just as vital. The bride catches your eye across the circle. She looks tired but happy, her hand resting lightly in her husband's. You imagine the days ahead for them, tending the small patch of land behind their cottage, keeping the goats fed, praying that the next harvest will be a good one. The fiddle music grows faster, and the dancers quicken their steps. You lean against the rough beam behind you, letting the rhythm seep into your bones. For a moment, you feel time dissolve past and present folding together in the flicker of lamplight. and the soft stamp of feet on earthen floor. You close your eyes, and the world narrows to the warmth of the hall, the sweetness of the rye bread, and the sound of voices rising in celebration. You open your eyes to find the dancing has finally slowed. The fiddler is wiping sweat from his brow, the last notes of the carol drifting into the smoky rafters. The bride sinks onto a bench, adjusting her wreath and brushing stray wisps of hair from her flushed face. The groom stands beside her, trying and mostly failing to look dignified after nearly tripping over 3 neighbors and a dog during the last spin. In this lull before the next round of dancing and drinking, you notice something you haven't had time to study closely yet. The clothes, not the extravagant silks of the nobility, but the wedding garments of all classes, layered in symbolism you'd probably miss if you weren't paying attention. The belt isn't just decorative, it signals her new status. Once she's married, she will wear it differently, tied in a particular knot that any observant neighbor could recognize at a glance. This was no small matter. In many places, the way you wore your girdle or veil could announce whether you were unmarried, betrothed, or safely wed. Historians still argue whether such distinctions were mostly about modesty or about making sure nobody accidentally courted someone already spoken for. Next to her, the groom fidgets with the clasp of his short wool mantle. It's dyed a murky green color, often favored by country folk who couldn't afford the expensive blues and reds flaunted by their betters. You overhear a man at the table explaining that only the wealthiest could wear garments lined with fur or trimmed in imported cloth. Everyone else relied on homespun and local dyes, wode for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow. The bride's gown, though modest, has been carefully made. You see how the seams have been reinforced with fine stitches, how the sleeves are a little fuller at the shoulder, subtle nod to fashion that she probably spent months planning. And pinned to her chest is a brooch shaped like a small bird, cut from a thin disc of bronze. Your mainstream historical fact: medieval wedding clothes often did double duty. They served as a public declaration of status and a private repository of inheritance if a marriage dissolved or a widow needed to support herself. Her garments could be sold or claimed as part of her dowry. You slip away from the bride and weave among the guests, studying the other outfits. A stout woman in a patched apron has bright ribbons braided into her hair, a festive touch that she only wears for church feasts and weddings. A young man is wearing a tunic several sizes too large, clearly borrowed for the occasion. It hangs around him like a child playing dress-up. He catches you staring and grins, lifting the hem to reveal that he's pinned it up with twine. By the door, a group of teenage girls cluster around the bride's unmarried sister, fussing over the way she's arranged her veil. You notice that her hair is partially uncovered, a sign she's still eligible, though likely not for long. One girl confides that she plans to wear her mother's old headdress when her own day comes, even if the mice have chewed it a little. You smile, picturing this lopsided relic held together with hope and careful mending. Your quirky tidbit: in some regions, wedding garments were scented with crushed herbs and flower petals. Brides might tuck sprigs of lavender, rosemary, or rue into the folds of their sleeves to ward off misfortune, or simply to mask the fact that laundry days were rare events. At the far end of the hall, the fiddler starts a softer tune. The newlyweds rise and walk together to the hearth, where they stand hand in hand. Someone hands them each a thin white candle, which they light from the central fire. This gesture, you realize, symbolizes the joining of their household's two flames, becoming one. A few children ooh quietly at the sight, and for a moment the room feels suspended between solemnity and celebration. The bride's mother dabs her eyes, smudging a trace of soot across her cheek. You think about how much care she must have taken to piece together her daughter's gown, and how every stitch and ribbon is loaded with expectations. A wedding isn't just a single day's 1,000 little choices that will be remembered long after the last dance. And you catch the way she glances at her new husband, as if seeing him for the first time. Outside, the evening has turned damp and chilly, but no one seems eager to leave. A few men slip out to relieve themselves by the barn wall, then hurry back in for more cider. Inside, the conversation turns again to the bride's clothes. An older woman insists the pattern on the sleeves comes from an old French design. Another swears it's local. You suspect they could argue about it until sunrise. You drift back to the bride one last time as she leans against the bench, holding the edge of her skirt to keep it from the floor. She looks tired, but there's a softness in her expression, a quiet satisfaction that maybe this day turned out as she'd hoped. You think of all the brides before her who wore this same wreath, tied this same belt, and wished for the same simple things: a full larder, a warm fire, and a husband who would keep his promises. The fiddle's song tapers off. You step outside into the darkness, breathing in the damp air. The last glow of lamplight spills across the threshold, illuminating a patch of trampled grass. As you walk away, you imagine that somewhere in the folds of her gown, the bride has tucked away a sprig of rosemary, something fragrant to remind her that even a modest wedding can feel like a beginning worth remembering. You wake the next morning with the faint impression of music still in your ears and the smell of smoke in your hair, but your attention is drawn to the large trestle tables being wiped down and prepared, again because a medieval wedding feast was rarely confined to a single evening. She winks at you as if to say, yes, we all need a little something to keep us upright after so much cider. A wedding feast in these times isn't merely about food. You watch as the groom's older brother carries in a basket of hard cheese and dried apples, placing them reverently at the center of the board. Your mainstream historical fact: in many parts of Europe, the size and variety of the wedding feast were regulated by local custom or even by law. Sumptuary rules limited how many courses could be served, lest the modest folk be tempted to bankrupt themselves in the pursuit of social standing. A hush falls as the bride and groom appear in the doorway, and their clothes have been brushed clean of the previous night's crumbs and splashes of ale. The bride carries a shallow dish heaped with small spiced cakes, which she offers to the nearest children first. You catch the way her hand trembles slightly, the exhaustion of ceremony and expectation finally catching up with her. Beside her, the groom raises a cup of cider. A ripple of approval moves through the crowd. A good speech isn't necessary, but gratitude is always expected. You find a spot on a low bench near the hearth, where the fiddler is propped against the wall, half dozing with his instrument across his lap. He rouses just enough to play a few cheerful notes as the first platters are passed around. You overhear her telling a neighbor that the couple received gifts of grain and a new iron pot, practical tokens that will help start their household. Begins to sing a bawdy tune about a bride who couldn't find her stockings on her wedding night. There's something softer in their glances now, an unspoken relief that the public ordeal is nearly over. Still, a wedding doesn't end at dawn. Historians still argue whether these long feasts were more about genuine community spirit or the subtle enforcement of social hierarchy. You suspect it's both. After all, a good host demonstrates generosity. A good guest knows how to admire it. Near you, an older man with a hawk-like nose and a patchy beard is holding forth about the dishes arrayed on the table. He points with his knife at a tureen of pottage thick with onions, leeks, and scraps of meat tanned, claims it's the best anyone will taste this year. He's probably right. For many guests, this is the richest meal they'll see until the next harvest feast or another wedding. In the corner, a girl balances on a stool to hang a small garland of herbs above the hearth. She explains to anyone who will listen that it's meant to keep evil spirits from spoiling the household's luck. You think she sounds very sure of herself, but you also suspect that nobody really wants to risk testing whether she's right. Superstition is woven into these occasions so thoroughly that it feels like a second language everyone speaks without thinking. The music swells again as the fiddler finds his energy and a few couples begin to dance. The bride's wreath has been replaced with a simpler kerchief, a sign that the rituals are drawing to a close and ordinary life is about to begin. Someone passes you a cup of small ale, and you sip it slowly, savoring the quiet camaraderie that settles over the room. You think about how many generations have marked their marriages in halls just like this. The same laughter, the same cautious hopes, the same relief when the last trencher is cleared away. Outside, the wind stirs the thatch on the rooftops. The sun is higher now, and the day feels like it shaking off the weight of ceremony and settling into a gentler rhythm. As you step back out into the fresh air, you carry the scents and sounds of the feast with you: roasted meat, sharp mustard, fiddle music, and the low murmur of voices wishing the couple a life of abundance. You follow the last stragglers out of the feasting hall, your steps slow with the pleasant heaviness of a too large meal. A few guests linger near the door, trading jokes about who drank the most and who will need help stumbling home. But there is one more ritual waiting, a part of medieval marriage that feels unsettling to your modern sensibilities. It's called the bedding ceremony. You trail the crowd around the side of the house, where a ladder leads up to the loft. Lanterns have been lit, casting shifting amber pools on the packed earth yard. Neighbors, kin, and a few strangers all jostle for a place to watch, their breath misting in the chill air. The newlyweds stand hand in hand at the foot of the ladder. You notice how pale the bride looks in the wavering light. The groom shifts his weight from foot to foot, cheeks blotchy with embarrassment. You almost expect someone to step in and declare this too private to witness, but here, privacy is a luxury few can afford. Historians still argue whether the bedding ceremony was more about ensuring consummation or simply providing evidence that the marriage was lawful. Either way, the communal involvement is unmistakable. This is the moment when the private becomes irreversibly public. A pair of older women step forward to remove the bride's wreath and loosen her girdle. Their movements are brisk, but not unkind, more like midwives preparing for a birth than gossips eager for spectacle. You feel an awkward ache in your chest, watching her shoulders tense as they unpin her veil. Someone produces a cup of spiced wine and presses it into the groom's hand. He gulps it so quickly that a little dribbles onto his tunic. A chorus of laughter rises around you. A neighbor claps him on the back and mutters something you can't catch, though you're sure it's some well-worn jest about what he should do next. Your mainstream historical fact. In many medieval communities, witnesses were expected to escort the couple to the marriage bed, and sometimes even remain in the room until they were under the covers. In certain noble households, the bedding ceremony ended with a priest blessing the sheets to underscore the religious seriousness of consummation. The procession moves forward. The couple climbs the ladder, the bride pausing at the top rung as though gathering every scrap of courage. When they vanish into the loft, a low murmur ripples through the crowd. You crane your neck to see the older women follow, carrying a candle and a folded sheet. The rest of the guests remain below, craning for any sign that the ritual has begun. A short man with a crooked nose leans close and whispers that in some households, the proof of consummation was literal. The bed linen would be displayed the next morning to confirm the bride's virginity. You try not to let your discomfort show, your quirky tidbit. Some communities believed that failing to consummate a marriage quickly would invite demons or witches to meddle in the union, causing barrenness or misfortune. As you wait, the crowd's chatter grows louder. A few children dart between adults, oblivious to the tension. A woman nearby hums under her breath, a wordless tune meant, you suspect, to fill the awkward silence. At last, the older women descend, their faces carefully neutral. They murmur a few words to the bride's mother, who nods solemnly. Nothing more is said, but the meaning is clear enough. The marriage has been properly begun. You sense a collective release of breath satisfaction that tradition has been observed and propriety maintained. Below the loft, guests begin to disperse. Some shuffle toward their own cottages, others linger to speculate about what the next months will bring. Children are gathered up and scolded for giggling. A pair of young women discuss whether the bride will be pregnant by midwinter. A few men take turns boasting about their own wedding nights, claims that sound increasingly far-fetched the longer they talk. The last embers of the bedding ceremony fade as neighbors slip away into the darkness. The house stands quiet now, lamplight glowing behind the slats of the loft wall. You imagine the bride lying awake, her heart still racing from the strange mixture of ritual and reality. You wonder if she feels married yet, or if she's only just beginning to grasp how her life has changed. You step back from the ladder, your breath frosting in the cold. The hush settles over the yard, broken only by the restless shuffle of a tethered goat. The bedding ceremony has ended, but its memory will linger as proof that everything was done correctly, that the union was witnessed, blessed, and however reluctantly approved by the community. As you turn away, you feel the weight of centuries pressing close. Even now, in your imagination, you can almost hear the voices rising in song after the final candle was extinguished. This is how medieval people secured the future, by making the most intimate moments as public as a feast, as shared as a prayer. You walk away from the quiet house, your steps measured, the hush of the bedding ceremony still clinging to your shoulders like an unwelcome draft. You pass a knot of guests lingering at the gate, their conversation low and speculative, as though they can't help but keep tally of who has fulfilled every obligation. But as you round the corner of the cottage, you spot something that brings a different energy altogether. A small group gathered around a table heaped with charms, trinkets, and bundles of herbs. In medieval life, superstition didn't end with the wedding vows. You ease closer, pretending to study a carved spindle so you can eavesdrop without being noticed. The bride's mother stands there, unwrapping a scrap of linen to reveal 3 little pouches filled with dried rosemary, juniper berries, and something that looks suspiciously like old bread crusts. She insists these will guard the young couple against envy and sickness. He explains that it should be buried under the hearthstone to keep out witches. Your mainstream historical fact. In many regions, it was common to place protective items in new households' amulets hidden in the eaves. Nearby, an older woman with startlingly bright eyes is pressing a silver coin into the bride's sister's hand. "Slip this under her pillow," she says in a conspiratorial whisper. So she dreams of a son. The sister accepts it with a look that mingles skepticism and curiosity, because even those who profess not to believe still prefer not to tempt fate. Your gaze drifts across the makeshift display. Iron keys, carved wooden hearts, scraps of parchment with prayers scrawled in crooked Latin. Each object seems to hum with urgency, as if the future depends on these humble tokens. Historians still argue whether these rituals were tolerated by the clergy or quietly condemned as dangerous superstition. Better a household stuffed with charms than a quarrel with half the village. One woman catches you staring and beckons you closer. She's holding a small bowl filled with milky liquids, some sort of herbal infusion. She dips a sprig of rosemary into it, then flicks droplets in the 4 cardinal directions, murmuring a blessing for health and plenty. You feel a shiver run down your spine, though you suspect the chill has more to do with the brisk night air than any magic at work. A little girl tugs at her mother's sleeve, holding up a fistful of dried lavender. For sweet dreams, she pipes up, proud to remember her part. You almost smile as the mother nods gravely, tucking the bundle into the crook of her arm, as though it were something precious. Your quirky tidbit. In some corners of Europe, it was believed that carrying a piece of stale bread from the wedding feast could protect a bride from infertility. She was expected to hide it discreetly in her Clodina crumbly insurance policy against the scorn of neighbors if she failed to produce children. As the final charms are distributed, the bride herself emerges, wrapped in a cloak and looking as if she's barely slept. She accepts each token with a bowed head, murmuring thanks to everyone who offers a blessing. You can see her fingers trembling as she tucks the small treasures into the pockets and folds of her gown. Someone produces a sprig of rue, its bitter scent cutting through the damp air. The bride hesitates before taking it. For a moment, you think she might refuse, but after a pause, she slips it into her sleeve. A quiet act of caution, just in case. The group begins to disperse. A few men drift back to their carts, already speculating about the next marriage to be arranged. 2 women linger to compare notes on whose charms have proved most reliable over the years. The bride stands alone for a moment, clutching her collection of small defenses against everything she can't control. They are hope in physical form, a way to fight back against uncertainty with whatever you can hold in your hand. The last candle is guttering out on the charm table, its flame wavering in the wind. You pause to watch it sputter and die. In the darkness that follows, you think about how many centuries have passed since people first tried to hold luck close, and how, even now, we all still carry something, a ring, a coin, a fragment of old belief, to reassure ourselves that life can be persuaded to turn out well. You wrap your cloak tighter around your shoulders, the cold settling deep into your bones, and you keep walking. You walk back down the rutted track, past the cottage where the last of the wedding guests are vanishing into the pre-dawn hush. The night feels emptied out, leaving only cold dew and the lingering scent of candle smoke clinging to your hair. But as you reach the small green near the church, you hear something that draws you in, a guinea-thin, wavering melody carried on the breeze. A pair of musicians are sitting on a low stone wall, fiddles balanced on their knees. Their fingers move in sleepy unison, coaxing out a tune that's as much lullaby as celebration. You ease closer and see that the bride's younger cousins have gathered to dance, their bare feet flickering across the trampled grass. The melody marked each milestone, the bride's procession, the binding of hands, the first dance as husband and wife. And now, long after most guests have staggered home, the music endures, as though the day itself is reluctant to end. You find a patch of dry ground and sit, your cloak pulled round your knees. The fiddle song is simple, just a repeating strain that circles back on itself like a story told by the hearth. Your mainstream historical fact. Professional minstrels often traveled from manor to manor, carrying news, gossip, and songs. A good musician could earn not just coins, but a warm place to sleep and a measure of respect, no matter how humble his birth. One of the musicians catches your eye and tips his head in greeting, never missing a beat. His companion closes his eyes as he plays, mouth moving in time to the rhythm, as if reciting a prayer. You realize that in a world without recordings or radios, the only way to preserve a song was to live it again and again until it became part of your memory, as surely as your own name. The dancers spin faster, skirts flaring in the breeze. A boy barely old enough to walk wobbles into the circle, shrieking with laughter as the older children guide him along, in a moment that feels outside of time. You think that this is the purest part of any wedding, the music that stitches the day together, binding everyone who hears it in a shared remembrance, an edible acknowledgement that his songs made the feast complete. The tune shifts, brightening. The bride herself emerges from the cottage doorway, wrapped in a heavy shawl. The notes wind around her like a benediction, carrying something softer than expectations, something that might almost be called relief. A few neighbors have returned, drawn by the music or simply by the need to witness every last moment of the celebration. Which guests left early? Which gifts will prove most useful? You wonder if they've been standing on this same patch of grass for every wedding in living memory. Historians still argue whether wedding music served mainly as entertainment or as a way to sanctify the even-tan audible marker that ordinary time had been suspended. But as you listen, you suspect it's simpler than that. Music is what makes the day feel real. It fills the silences between vows and feasts and anxious glances. It keeps everyone tethered to the idea that marriage is more than obligation. It can also be joy. One of the dancers breaks away, breathless, and crouches to catch her wind. She grins up at you, hair stuck damply to her forehead, and you see how young she is, no more than 12, but already rehearsing the steps she dance at her own wedding. You wonder if she's thinking about the gown she'll wear, or the songs she'll ask the fiddlers to play. The melody slows, the final notes stretching into a long, sweet sigh. The children drift to the edges of the green, faces flushed, the night suddenly too quiet. The musicians lower their bows, flexing stiff fingers. One of them murmurs that dawn is close, and it's time to pack away their instruments. You feel a pang as the music dies, as though a thread has been snipped. The bride lifts her hand in farewell before slipping back inside. You have the odd sense she's taking the last of the celebration with her, tucking it into her memory before the new day demands her full attention. As the fiddlers disappear down the lane, you stand, brushing dew from your cloak. The hush that follows feels deeper than silence. And in that hush, you understand music was the secret language of the medieval wedding, the one thing that belonged to everyone, noble or peasant, young or old. It made a life-changing day feel almost bearable, sometimes even beautiful. You wait a moment, listening to the last tremor of the fiddle song fade into the pre-dawn stillness. Then you start walking again, feeling as though the air itself has grown heavier. In the center of it all, you spot the small table where guests left gift coins, bolts of cloth, baskets of grain. But tucked among these practical offerings are objects with meaning that reaches far beyond their humble appearance. Wedding symbols and tokens, each one carrying a secret weight. You drift closer, drawn by curiosity as much as by the need to rest your legs. On the tabletop sits a polished wooden box, the lid propped open to reveal a delicate circlet of braided straw. The bride's sister fingers it reverently. "My mother wore this," she says, voice low, "and my grandmother before her." The circle is humble, but it's woven through with generations of vows and expectations, an inheritance that has nothing to do with wealth. Beside it, someone has laid out a slender iron key. You recognize this instantly. It symbolizes the transfer of responsibility. From this day forward, the bride holds the keys to the household stores, the chests, the larder. It's a gesture that says, this is yours to guard, your mainstream historical fact. In many medieval communities, presenting the household keys was as important as exchanging rings. It was proof that a wife had become the mistress of her new domain. Next to the key lies a knotted cord, dyed blue with woad. You watch as a neighbor picks it up, explaining that it's a love knot, twisted in a specific pattern, believed to protect a marriage from jealousy or betrayal. Historians still argue whether such knots had pagan origins or were simply folk art that acquired symbolic meaning over centuries. Either way, no bride would dismiss them out of hand. She mutters that the petals are meant to bring prosperity, though she can't say exactly how. You have to smile. In medieval life, practicality and superstition were tangled like the stems in that garland. Your quirky tidbit in some villages. A bride was expected to tuck a tiny piece of bread into her shoe to ensure there would always be food on her table. A sudden draft lifts the hem of your cloak, and you glance up to see the bride herself emerging from the cottage doorway. She moves slowly, shoulders hunched, as though bracing for the day ahead. One by one, she collects the symbols from the table, cradling them in her arms. A hush falls over the onlookers as she accepts the iron key. You see her lips move in a silent prayer, perhaps simply a moment of gratitude that this long ordeal is nearly over. She pauses beside a small boy holding a bunch of herbs, and he thrusts them at her with the solemnity of a priest. She bends low, accepts them, and tucks the bundle carefully into her belt. You watch her straighten, and in that moment, she seems taller, steadier. The tokens have transformed her from a daughter into a wife, whether she feels it yet or not. Beside you, a man in a patched cloak mutters that symbols are all very well, but they won't mend a broken fence or cure a sick cow. But even as he says it, he crosses himself, when the bride walks past. Historians debate whether these wedding tokens were mostly psychological comforts, or if they carried genuine legal weight. You suspect the answer is both. They made the intangible real, gave shape to promises that otherwise might dissolve in the rough winds of daily life. The bride reaches the last of the gifts, a slender ring carved from bone. She hesitates before sliding it onto her finger, where it sits above the plain metal band she received during the vows. You think of all the hands that wore such rings before her women, who hoped the little circle of bone would be enough to hold a marriage together. As the sun climbs higher, she gathers her skirts, clutching the tokens to her chest. The guests part for her without a word. One by one, they turn to go home. You stand a moment longer, watching her silhouette framed against the doorway. There is something achingly human in the way she glances down at her collection of small assurances, as if reassuring herself that they will be enough. When she disappears inside, you finally turn away. The table is empty now, bare wood exposed to the morning light. But in your mind you still see the circlet of straw, the knotted cord, the key lying in the bride's hand, a quiet promise that even in a hard world, people will always find ways to mark the beginning of something hoped for. You step away from the deserted gift table, your footsteps muffled by the churned-up straw and damp earth. The village is slowly waking, the wedding giving way to ordinary life. Again roosters crowing, doors creaking open, the thump of wood being chopped for the day's fires. You wander toward the edge of the green, drawn by the low, urgent voices of 3 men bent over a cracked bench. They're poring over a roll of parchment so wide it drapes onto the ground. Even without seeing the faded ink, you know exactly what it is. The marriage contract. This is the part of a medieval wedding that rarely makes it into romantic ballads, but it's as crucial as the vows themselves. You edge close enough to read the cramped writing, though the Latin makes your head spin. Your mainstream historical fact. In most of Europe, marriage contracts spelled out not just the dowry, but also the rights and obligations of each spouse, contingency plans in case of death, and sometimes even penalties if one party failed to meet expectations. It was both a promise and an insurance policy. The groom's father is there, a stooped man with watery eyes who keeps dabbing at his nose as though the contract itself makes him nervous. He points to a section near the top, voice quavering as he insists that the promised plot of barley land is indeed included. The scriban, anxious youth whose fingers are stained black with ink knots, and makes a tiny notation in the margin. Historians still argue whether these contracts protected women or simply codified their dependence. You suspect it's both. For some brides, this document was the only formal guarantee they would have a roof over their heads if their husbands died or vanished. For others, it was a cage they never escaped. A short, sharp gust of wind rustles the parchment, and you glimpse the bride's name in looping letters, paired with a solemn phrase about her lawful heirs. You imagine how surreal it must feel to see your life summarized in a few lines of ink, your worth measured in coin, land, and promises you didn't have the power to negotiate. Nearby, the bride's mother watches with folded arms, her face carefully blank. Every so often she lifts her gaze toward the house, as if to check that her daughter hasn't slipped away in the confusion. You wonder whether she feels relief that the contract is signed, or regret that her daughter's future is now as fixed as her own was. The scribe clears his throat and reads out a clause about what will happen if the groom dies within the first year of marriage. A hush falls. Even the wind seems to pause. You can feel how the moment changes, how the ceremony's joy recedes before this cold acknowledgement of mortality. If the groom dies, the bride is entitled to a third of the household goods and a portion of the grain, but only if she hasn't committed notorious offense, a phrase that trembles on the edge of threat. Your quirky tidbit: some marriage contracts included an inventory of the bride's trousseau down to the last wooden spoon, so there could be no dispute about which items were hers if she became a widow. In wealthier families, these inventories could fill entire parchment rolls. The scribe pauses again to sharpen his quill with a tiny blade, the scraping sound loud in the morning quiet. You study his hands, marveling at the precision required to record every obligation without error. A single smudge could become the seed of a lawsuit years later. When he resumes reading, his voice has a sing-song cadence, as if he's reciting a litany he no longer hears. He lists the witnesses, some of whom have already gone home to nurse hangovers, and concludes with a prayer that God will grant the union prosperity and many children. You feel the strangeness of that juxtaposition. A legal document ending with an invocation of divine goodwill. At last, the groom steps forward, dips the quill in ink, and scratches his mark at the bottom. The bride's father does the same, his hand trembling so violently that the letters look like a bird's footprint in mud. You sense a collective exhale as the scribe sands the page, sprinkling the fine grains over the wet ink to keep it from smearing. The parchment is carefully rolled and slipped into a leather tube. You watch as the scribe ties it closed with a bit of twine, then seals it with a blob of dark wax stamped with a crude cross. It will be stored in the manor chest or the church archive, proof that the marriage was more than just a spoken promise. Proof that everyone knew what was owed, what was pledged, and what was at stake. The groom's father clears his throat. "It's done," he says, though he sounds more weary than triumphant. The men drift away in twos and threes, already speculating about which contracts will be drawn up next season. You remain a moment longer, picturing that parchment resting among dozens of others, thousands, if you count every village in Christendom, each one a record of hope, calculation, and fear, each one a reminder that love and obligation have never been so separate as we pretend. As the sun lifts higher, you turn back toward the village. A rooster crows somewhere behind you, and you imagine the bride still sleeping upstairs, unaware that her future has just been bound with wax and ink. You leave the scribe and his parchment behind, following the winding track back toward the church. The air has warmed just enough to lift a few early insects into the sunbeams slanting across the village green. For a moment, everything seems simple, just another day after a wedding. But as you approach the porch of the church, you hear a different kind of whisper, the soft, careful gossip of people weighing whether a union was ever valid at all. You slip into the shadows to listen. 3 women stand near the doorway, their heads close, hands fluttering in nervous little gestures. You can tell by their voices that this is no ordinary curiosity. This is the murmur of scandal, of a marriage on the verge of being called forbidden. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely shocked by such accusations, or merely fascinated by the drama. But you suspect it was both. The stakes were too high to be indifferent. One of the women, a pale, narrow-shouldered widow with a voice like a blade leans in to whisper that she's heard the bride and groom are related. Second cousins, she hisses, maybe closer. The other women draw back a fraction, as if the rumor itself might be contagious. Your mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, consanguinity laws forbade marriage between people who shared a common ancestor within 4 degrees, effectively meaning third cousins or closer. Violating those rules could mean annulment, disgrace, or worse. You peer around the edge of the doorway. The priest stands inside, leafing through a heavy volume bound in cracked leather. If he suspects a forbidden marriage has occurred, he'll be duty-bound to report it. You imagine the dread curling in the bride's stomach if word of this rumor reaches her. Outside, the widow is warming to her story, describing how she saw the couple standing too close years before their betrothal. Another woman shakes her head, insisting it's all jealousy because the bride's dowry was richer than expected. The third only sighs and says, "Let the priest decide." You think she means it, though her eyes gleam with curiosity. Just then, a stooped old man hobbles past, leaning heavily on a crooked staff. He mutters that the bride's father once promised her to another family entirely, and that the prior vow makes this wedding invalid. His voice is hoarse but certain, the kind of tone that makes people believe even the thinnest evidence. Your quirky tidbit, clandestine marriages, those performed without banns or parental consent, were surprisingly common. In some places, all you needed were witnesses and mutual consent, no priest required. But they carried enormous risk, and the threat of annulment never really faded. The women exchange glances, weighing which story will stick. You feel a shiver despite the warm air. In this world, reputation is as fragile as spun glass, and it can shatter on a rumor's edge. The priest emerges at last, blinking in the light. He lifts one hand, a silent command for quietent. The women fall back, chastened. You wonder if he's already heard the gossip, or if he simply recognizes that wherever marriage contracts are signed, suspicion soon follows. He clears his throat. "There is no evidence," he says, voice flat. "If you have a concern, bring witnesses." His gaze sweeps over them, daring anyone to step forward. No one does, not today. The women avert their eyes, as if they hadn't spent the last quarter hour rehearsing accusations. You watch them drift away, their steps slower now, though you know they'll carry the story home to every hearth in the village. It will grow in the telling, more details, more certainty, more harm. The bride and groom may never hear the whispers directly, but in a place where everyone's life is woven into everyone else's, suspicion doesn't have to be shouted to do its work. Historians still debate whether these prohibitions about kinship were enforced out of genuine religious conviction, or simply as a convenient way to unravel marriages that no longer suited powerful families. You suspect the truth is as tangled as the laws themselves. You turn from the porch, the sun bright on your face. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, you hear a child singing a high, thin note that feels like a reminder that life moves on, even as old secrets stir beneath the surface. And you think of the bride again, her hand gripping the iron key, her eyes full of quiet hope. You wonder if she knows how close her marriage came to being questioned, whether she would care, or whether she has already learned what every medieval woman knew, that sometimes survival depends on simply pretending not to hear. You leave the church porch behind, the gossips scattering like sparrows as you pass. The road winds toward a cluster of cottages on the village's edge, where you notice a gathering you hadn't expected. 3 matrons, standing with folded arms beside a skinny, nervous-looking girl. She can't be more than 13. Her hair is still bound in 2 braids, but her gown is new. And there it is, the hush that falls over you when you realize this is another betrothal. The matrons glance your way but don't beckon. They're busy studying the girl's face, as though searching for signs of readiness, or at least resignation. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't just the business of adults. Sometimes it began almost before childhood ended. Your mainstream historical fact. A betrothal contract could be made even younger, so long as consent was renewed when the couple came of age. The girl fidgets, plucking at the edge of her sleeve. Her mother murmurs to her in low, soothing tones that sound more like instructions than comfort. You wonder if she even knows the man she'll marry, or whether she's only heard about him in snatches of conversation and hasty promises. A stooped woman with a red scarf, likely the girl's aunt, begins, listing the dowry items in a hushed monotone. 2 goats, 3 sacks of barley, a loom, a small coffer lined with linen. You feel an ache behind your ribs at the thought of a life decided before a child has finished growing. One of the older women sighs. Best to wed them young, she mutters, before they get ideas. You suspect she doesn't mean that cruelly, only practically. In a world this precarious, marriage was less about desire and more about survival. Historians still argue whether most child brides actually began cohabiting at 12, or if the formal marriage was delayed until they were older. Evidence suggests the practice varied by region, by family wealth, and by the urgency of securing alliances. But no matter how you parse it, 13 is an impossible age to carry so many expectations. The girl glances up at you, wide-eyed, and you feel the sudden weight of her unspoken questions. What will he be like? Will he be kind? Will I ever have a choice again? You have no answers. Neither do the women guiding her through this rite. Your quirky tidbit in some regions. Betrothal contracts included a clause specifying the number of years before the bride would move into her husband's household, effectively a countdown to the end of her girlhood. A man approaches a tall figure in a patched wool tunic. You guess by the way he hangs back that he's the prospective groom, barely 16 himself. He looks equally overwhelmed. Someone nudges him forward. He raises his eyes to the girl and manages a small, tight smile. It's so fleeting, you almost think you imagined it. A witness steps up with a sheaf of parchment. The betrothal terms are read aloud in the same measured tone you've heard again and again. Promises of land, of support, of obedience. The girl's voice is soft but steady when she answers. You wonder how many times she has practiced this moment in her mind, wishing it were done already. The scribe scratches her name onto the parchment. In a generation, she might be one of the matrons, standing here with folded arms, ushering another child into the same fate. You try to picture her older, more confident, but all you see is her narrow shoulders and the way her hands curl into fists in her skirt. The final blessing is spoken some mixture of prayer and legal formula, and the parchment is rolled away. The girl's mother presses a small ribbon into her hand, dyed a soft blue. You realize it's a token, a sign that she belongs to someone now. Not quite a wife, but no longer free. Historians still debate whether families felt guilt about such early unions, or whether necessity hardened them to the cost. Perhaps the answer is in the way this girl's mother holds her so tightly afterward, her face hidden in her hair. The groom's father beckons the boy away to speak in low tones about expectations and duties. You catch references to harvest yields, to dowry payments, to children not yet conceived. The boy nods, looking sick. The girl stands alone for a moment, twisting the blue ribbon between her fingers. You take a step back as the group disperses, their voices blending into the morning sounds of the village. Roosters, dogs, the ring of a smith's hammer. The girl lingers in the yard, her gaze fixed on the road that leads away. You imagine she's wondering what lies beyond the hedgerows and whether she'll ever walk there by choice. At last, she turns and follows her mother home, each step slow, deliberate, as though she's practicing the role she'll be expected to play for the rest of her life. You tread quietly behind the departing figures, your mind still tangled in the image of that young girl and her fragile blue ribbon. The village begins to stir fully, nalders open, smoke curls upward, and the scents of baking bread and freshly churned earth mingle in the morning air. You make your way toward the village square, where a small crowd has gathered near a well-worn wooden bench. Here, two men are locked in what looks like a heated discussion. You edge closer, catching bits of their arguments, something about payments, debts, and the marriage that never was. This is no ordinary quarrel. It's about the legal status of a marriage, and the consequences ripple far beyond the couple involved. Your mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, disputes over marriage legitimacy were common and could drag on for years in secular or ecclesiastical courts. Issues like clandestine weddings, bigamy, or consanguinity might be raised to invalidate unions, often with dramatic effects on inheritance and social standing. One man, a burly blacksmith with a rough beard, insists that his daughter's marriage was never solemnized properly because the priest wasn't present. The other, a thin man in a threadbare cloak, counters that mutual consent and witnesses should have been enough. They speak in low voices, but you can feel the tension like a coiled spring. A woman nearby shakes her head, muttering that no good ever comes from couples who wed without their parents' blessing. She pulls her shawl tighter, as if warding off bad luck itself. You notice a few others nod silently, their faces marked by quiet frustration or weary resignation. The dispute unfolds like a play you've seen before. Claims and counterclaims, demands for proof, appeals to authority. The priest arrives, looking grave, and the men turn toward him, as though hoping for judgment. His expression is unreadable as he listens, fingers steepled beneath his chin. You realize this isn't just a family matter. It's a reminder that marriage in this era is a web of social contracts and legal bindings, a personal relationship wrapped in layers of obligation that often felt suffocating. Your quirky tidbit. In some cases, couples who had married clandestinely would renew their vows publicly to avoid legal challenges later. It was a practical workaround, but didn't always satisfy everyone involved. As the priest speaks, the crowd listens intently. He explains that the church requires marriages to be announced in the parish for 3 consecutive Sundays before the ceremony, known as bans, to allow objections. Without this, unions were vulnerable to annulment. This public declaration was designed to prevent secret marriages, but sometimes became a tool for rival families to sabotage alliances. The blacksmith's face tightens as the priest's words sink in. He glances at his daughter's faded gown and the tattered piece of parchment she carries, their only proof of the union. You sense the weight of disappointment, the fear that all their hopes might unravel. The other man scoffs, saying that traditions vary, and in some places, witnessing by the village elders was sufficient. The debate grows louder, and the crowd shifts uneasily. You step back, letting the conversation fade into the morning bustle. The issue of clandestine marriages casts a long shadow over the community. You think of the bride and groom from last night, wondering if they made sure to announce their intentions properly, or if their union too might face challenges. As you continue walking, the sun climbs higher, warming the air and lighting the faces of people going about their day. Marriage here is never just about love, it's a transaction, a social event, and sometimes a legal battle, all at once. You tuck these thoughts away and press on, knowing the village will continue its rhythms. Marriages will be made and unmade, and the age-old dance between hope and obligation will go on. You drift along the village path, the heated voices fading behind you as you approach a small weathered cottage nestled beneath a gnarled oak tree. The sun filters through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the rough stone walls. Here, you find a woman sitting by a spinning wheel, her fingers deftly turning flax into thread as she hums a quiet tune. This is a widow, you realize, recently returned from the world of marriage and loss. Her gaze drifts toward the horizon, and you sense she's thinking about what it means to be remarried or not remarried in this world. Your mainstream historical fact: widows in medieval Europe occupied a complex social space. They could inherit property and run households, but their remarriage was often subject to family and church approval. A neighbor approaches, carrying a basket of eggs. They exchange a few words in hushed tones about the widow's prospects. "She's strong," the neighbor says. But some families see widows as threats to independence. The widow smiles faintly, but doesn't reply. You watch as the woman unfolds a faded cloth, revealing a wedding gown that's seen better days. It's trimmed with lace and embroidered with small flowers, painstakingly sewn over many months. She smooths the fabric, as if drawing comfort from its weight and memory. Your quirky tidbit, sometimes white, sometimes a muted shade in between. The length of mourning could be years, during which remarriage was frowned upon or forbidden. Some women marked the passing of time by adjusting the trim or color of their veils. The widow's hands are steady as she resumes spinning, but her eyes carry a quiet sadness. You wonder if she ever dreams of returning to the altar, or if the weight of past vows anchors her firmly in the present. Nearby, a group of women debate whether the widow should attend the upcoming festival. She stirred trouble, one warns, or worse, attract unwanted attention. Another argues that a widow's presence is a blessing, a symbol of endurance and hope. Historians still argue whether widows had more agency than their unmarried or married counterparts, or if they were simply navigating a new set of constraints. You suspect the truth is nuanced, full of small rebellions and compromises. The spinning wheel turns steadily, a soft rhythm that seems to echo the slow passage of time itself. You think about the widow's life, the marriage she once knew, the loss she has endured, and the uncertain future stretching out before her. As the sun climbs higher, you stand and stretch, feeling the pulse of the village in your veins. Marriage is not just about beginnings. It is also about endings, about what comes next, and how people choose or are forced to carry on. You take one last look at the widow before turning away, carrying with you the silent resilience of a life shaped by love, loss, and quiet courage. You step away from the spinning wheel's steady hum, the widow's quiet strength lingering in your thoughts as you approach the village square once more. Here, the air is charged with whispered rumors and tentative glances on other kind of ritual, less sacred but no less powerful. A cluster of villagers surrounds a makeshift pulpit fashioned from an overturned barrel. At its center stands a priest, his robes slightly askew, his expression stern yet weary. He holds a parchment aloft, reading aloud a list of marriage annulments granted in recent months. The crowd listens, some with solemn faces, others with barely concealed smirks. Your mainstream historical fact: annulments in medieval Europe were rare, but not unheard of. Grounds included consanguinity, prior vows, impotence, or coercion. While divorce, as we know it, was impossible, annulment legally erased a marriage as if it never happened, freeing parties to remarry. The priest's voice echoes in the square as he recounts cases. A noblewoman released from a union due to unconsummated marriage, a merchant's son freed because the bride was already wed in another parish, a farmer's daughter granted annulment for lack of parental consent. Each case seems to stir different reactions among the listeners. A merchant woman mutters that some annulments are nothing but schemes to dodge debts or secure better matches. An elderly man nods, claiming that wealth often buys freedom. You notice how justice seems uneven, bending to the wills of those with influence. Your quirky tidbit, impotence, was a surprisingly common reason cited for annulments, sometimes proven by scandalous tests that involved witnesses in the marriage beta practice that, for obvious reasons, historians debate fiercely. The crowd's mood shifts as the priest finishes reading. Some call for stricter enforcement of marriage laws. Others suggest that too much meddling breaks the bonds that hold communities together. You sense an undercurrent of anxiety. Marriage is both a sacred contract and a practical necessity, and when it unravels, the fallout touches everyone. Nearby, a young woman in a faded dress listens intently, her fingers gripping the edge of her cloak. You wonder if she's contemplating her own future, weighing the risks and promises of marriage in a world where vows can be undone by ink and accusation. A group of teenagers break the tension with nervous laughter, whispering about the scandalous details of some annulments. Their jokes carry the sharp edge of gossip, but you detect a hint of fear. Too, their own lives are not yet set, and the uncertainty feels palpable. As the priest folds the parchment and prepares to leave, you catch his tired glance sweeping the crowd. He knows that marriage is at once the foundation and the fault line of the village's fragile order. You turn away, stepping back into the village's rhythm, the marketplace opening. Children chasing each other through the streets, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The stories of love, loss, and legal battles continue to unfold here as they have for centuries. And you carry with you the echo of the priest's voice and the weight of every vow spoken, broken, or restored in the name of marriage. You follow the fading echoes of the priest's voice into a narrow alley where a group of young couples gathers, leaning close beneath a canopy of twisted vines. The air is thick with the scent of crushed herbs and the quiet murmur of promises exchanged in the shadows. These are clandestine marriages, the secret unions whispered about but rarely acknowledged openly. The flickering torchlight illuminates faces both hopeful and wary. You watch as one couple joins hands, their vows barely audible over the crackle of fire and the distant tolling of the village bell. There is no priest here, no scribe, only the weight of their own words and the presence of a handful of trusted witnesses. Your mainstream historical fact. Throughout the Middle Ages, clandestine marriages were surprisingly common, especially among those who sought to bypass parental control or ecclesiastical restrictions. The Church condemned these unions, but enforcing its laws in remote villages was often impractical. One young man, his voice low but firm, swears loyalty to his bride, promising to defend and cherish her. She responds with equal conviction, her eyes shining in the firelight. You can feel the urgency in their words. This is not just a ritual, but a rebellion against the structures that bind them. Nearby, a woman in a worn cloak watches with a mixture of concern and envy. She whispers that such marriages can be dangerous, lacking legal protection. The partners are vulnerable to annulment or scandal. Yet, for many, it's the only path to love or autonomy. Your quirky tidbit. Some clandestine couples carried small tokens rings, carved from bone or simple cords, tied around their wrists to signify their union, a secret badge of commitment hidden from disapproving eyes. As the vows end, the witnesses clasp hands, sealing the pact. The couple shares a brief kiss, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. For a moment, the world narrows to this circle of trust and defiance. Historians still argue whether clandestine marriages undermined the Church's authority or reflected a deeper human need for connection beyond social constraints. You sense it's both a quiet challenge and a hopeful embrace. The couple slips away into the darkness, leaving the alley empty but charged with the residue of promises made under stars. You linger a moment longer, pondering the courage it takes to claim love in a world that might not forgive. As you step back onto the village street, the sounds of everyday life welcome you, the clatter of carts, the laughter of children, the call of a distant market vendor. Love, law, and longing intertwine here, woven into the very fabric of medieval life. You follow the winding lane from the village center toward a modest house where a widow has recently taken residence. The sun is dipping low, casting long shadows over the thatched roofs and rutted paths. Inside, the widow sits by a small fire, stitching a worn piece of cloth as she contemplates the possibility of remarriage, a decision fraught with complexities, both personal and societal. Widows in medieval times occupied a precarious position. They often controlled their late husband's property and managed households. But remarriage could mean relinquishing that hard-won autonomy. Some widows embraced new matches quickly to secure protection and financial stability, while others remained solitary, navigating the judgments of neighbors and clergy alike. You notice how the widow carefully folds a letter or proposal from a neighboring landholder seeking her hand. Her fingers linger over the seal, torn between hope and hesitation. This moment captures the fragile balance of medieval widowhood, agency tempered by social expectation. A curious neighbor drops by with news of upcoming market days and village events, chatting casually but with an undercurrent of concern about the widow's future. The villagers understand that a widow's remarriage can reshape alliances and property lines, sometimes sparking tension and rivalries. Your quirky tidbit. Some communities required widows to observe a formal mourning period, sometimes a year or more, for remarrying. marked by wearing specific clothing and abstaining from festive gatherings. These customs served both as respect for the deceased and as social control. As evening deepens, the widow rises to tend her small garden, the scent of herbs mingling with the smoke from her hearth. You sense her determination, the resilience that carries her through uncertain days. Historians debate whether widows wielded significant power in medieval society, or if their status was largely defined by their relationships with men. The truth likely lies in the everyday negotiations of survival, memory, and community that shaped each widow's unique path. You step back into the cooling night, carrying the quiet strength of a woman who navigates the boundaries of loss and renewal with grace and courage. You leave the widow's cottage behind and walk toward the bustling village square, now alive with merchants setting up stalls and children darting between carts. Amid the hum of daily life, a small commotion draws your attention, a dispute over a wedding gift gone awry. Two men stand face to face, tension crackling between them like the sparks from the blacksmith's forge nearby. The argument centers on a prized wedding gift, a finely wrought silver goblet that was promised but never delivered. One man accuses the other of bad faith, threatening to take the matter to the local lord's court. The other insists the gift was given, just not in the manner expected. You realize this isn't just about a missing cup. Wedding gifts in medieval society were symbols of alliances, respect, and obligation. When gifts were withheld or disputed, it could mean fractured relationships and social standing at risk. Your mainstream historical fact, gifts exchanged during weddings ranged from practical household items to lavish treasures. They were often formally recorded in marriage contracts or dowry lists to prevent future conflicts. Nearby, a group of women whisper about a bride whose lavish gifts sparked jealousy and rumor. Your quirky tidbit. In some villages, it was customary for guests to throw coins into a bride's lap during the reception, both as a blessing and a public display of generosity. As the men's voices rise, a village elder steps in, urging calm and reminding them that disputes over gifts should be resolved through mediation, not quarrels. You watch as the men reluctantly lower their voices, knowing that public discord reflects poorly on both families. The crowd disperses, conversations returning to everyday matters. Yet you sense that beneath the surface, the weight of social expectation and obligation lingers, shaping not only weddings but the entire fabric of village life. You continue on your way, the silver goblet's story, a reminder that marriage in medieval times was as much about community and contracts as it was about two people joining together. You stroll away from the village square, the echoes of the dispute fading into the morning bustle. Your path leads you past a small chapel where a group has gathered to witness a different kind of ritual. The blessing of a newly married couple as home. Inside, the air is thick with incense and candle smoke, mingling with the earthy scent of wooden beams and fresh straw. The priest moves slowly from room to room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers meant to sanctify the space and protect the household from evil. This blessing is not merely spiritual. It serves as a public acknowledgement of the new family unit's place in the community. Your mainstream historical fact. Home blessings after marriage were common in medieval Europe, often performed by clergy to invoke divine favor on the couple's future. You watch as the bride and groom stand hand in hand, faces solemn yet hopeful. The couple's eyes meet briefly, sharing a silent promise amid the sacred ceremony. Nearby, a matron offers a small basket of herbs to the bride, symbolizing health and abundance. Your quirky tidbit. Some households hung wreaths of garlic and rue at their doors, believed to ward off malevolent spirits and bring good luck. As the blessing concludes, the couple lights a candle together, their joined flame flickering against the stone walls. The congregation offers quiet applause, a communal affirmation of support and welcome. You step back into the fading daylight, feeling the weight of tradition and hope intertwined in this simple act. Marriage, you realize, was not only a personal journey, but a communal promise, sealed by faith and fellowship. With the blessing complete, you turn toward the village path, carrying with you the sense of a future both fragile and fiercely protected. You wander from the chapel into the village marketplace, now bustling with merchants, farmers, and villagers preparing for the day ahead. Among the chatter and clatter, your attention is drawn to a small group gathered near a merchant's stall, examining the gifts destined for the bride and groom. Wedding gifts in medieval times were more than mere presents. They were carefully chosen symbols of status, alliances, and goodwill. You watch as bolts of fine linen, carved wooden utensils, and small silver coins are laid out, each one carrying meaning far beyond its material value. Your mainstream historical fact, gift-giving at weddings, was governed by complex customs. Guests often brought items that complemented the couple's dowry or reflected their own social standing. Lavish gifts could elevate a family's prestige, while modest offerings conveyed respect and community ties. A merchant explains that a particular embroidered cloth was commissioned especially for this wedding, adorned with heraldic symbols representing the union of two powerful families. You notice the bride's eyes light up at the sight, understanding the message woven into every stitch. Your quirky tidbit: in some regions, guests would bring live animals, hens, goats, or even pigs as gifts, providing the couple with immediate resources to build their household. Handling such gifts required skill and sometimes led to amusing mishaps. Nearby, a young woman marvels at a set of intricately carved wooden bowls, commenting that they will last through many years of meals and memories. Another guest produces a small casket filled with spiced preserves, explaining that the sweet treats symbolize hope for a prosperous and joyous marriage. As the gift-giving continues, you notice the delicate balance between generosity and obligation. Each gift is a public statement, a thread in the social fabric, binding families and communities together. You sense the unspoken pressures beneath the smiles, and thanks a dance as old as marriage itself. You step away from the stall, the weight of centuries-old customs resting lightly on your shoulders. In medieval weddings, as in life, every gesture mattered. Each gift, a story, a promise, and a hope for the future. You meander through the marketplace, the sounds of bartering voices and clinking coins fading behind you as you find yourself near the village well, where a quiet ceremony is unfolding. A small group of women gathers around a bride-to-be, their hands busy weaving a delicate garland of wildflowers and herbs. This is a pre-wedding ritual, one rooted deep in folk tradition, intended to bless the bride with fertility, protection, and good fortune. You watch as the women work, exchanging soft smiles and murmured prayers that seem to float on the gentle breeze. Your mainstream historical fact: such herbal wreaths were common in many medieval communities, symbolizing not just beauty, but the hope for children and a prosperous household. Different flowers carried different meanings: lavender for calm, rosemary for remembrance, and rue for protection. A nearby girl holds up a sprig of thyme, explaining its power to bring courage to the bride as she steps into her new life. You marvel at how these simple plants carried complex layers of meaning, woven seamlessly into the fabric of daily life. Your quirky tidbit: in some regions, brides were expected to wear these wreaths throughout the wedding day, sometimes replacing them with fresh garlands for each stage of the ceremony, ensuring continuous blessings. As the garlands are finished, the bride lifts the wreath over her head with a shy smile, her cheeks flushed with excitement and nerves. The women place their hands on her shoulders, offering blessings that blend faith and folklore. You feel the soft warmth of the moment, a quiet interlude where ancient customs and personal hope entwine. It's a reminder that medieval weddings were not only legal contracts and grand feasts, but also deeply human celebrations of love, life, and community. As the women disperse and the bride prepares to join the festivities, you carry with you the scent of wildflowers and the enduring power of ritual. You follow the trail from the village green up a gentle slope to the small manor where a different kind of wedding is underway, one that bridges worlds. Here, a minor knight is marrying the daughter of a prosperous merchant, a union that blends the old feudal order with the rising power of commerce. Inside the great hall, banners bearing coats of arms hang alongside, bolts of rich fabric and crates of exotic spices brought by traders from far-off lands. The bride's gown is a careful mix of sturdy cloth and delicate embroidery, signaling both her family's wealth and her new status among the gentry. Your mainstream historical fact: cross-class marriages like this were becoming more common in the late Middle Ages, reflecting shifting social structures as mercantile wealth challenged hereditary privilege. These unions could bring new resources and alliances, but also sparked tension on both sides. The groom's relatives eye the bride's family with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, whispering about whether merchants truly understand the responsibilities of noble life. Meanwhile, the bride's kin admire the knight's sword and heraldry, but question the rigidity of his customs. A lively debate unfolds near the hearth about appropriate wedding gifts: silver goblets from the merchant's vault versus finely wrought armor and horse tack from the knight's stables. The atmosphere is charged with both possibility and unease. Your quirky tidbit: some merchants insisted on incorporating their own symbols into the knightly heraldry, leading to strange coats of arms that mixed fleur-de-lis with barrels of ale or scales, confusing heralds for generations. As the ceremony proceeds, you notice the bride and groom exchanging glances filled with both hope and uncertainty, aware that their marriage will demand negotiation as much as affection. Historians still argue whether these cross-class marriages ultimately diluted noble traditions or enriched society by fostering new connections and opportunities. You step back from the bustling hall, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses fading into the evening air, reflecting on how marriage in medieval times was a living, evolving institution, rooted in tradition, yet responding to change. You step away from the manor's glow and find yourself wandering along a narrow path lined with wildflowers and brambles. The village is quieter here, the sounds of festivity replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant song of birds settling for the evening. Your thoughts turn inward as you contemplate what marriage meant beyond the ceremonies and contracts the expectations, the roles, the unspoken rules. You recall the words of medieval preachers who instructed that a wife must be obedient to her husband, managing the household with diligence and care. Yet, beneath this surface of submission lay an intricate balance. Wives were expected to be clever managers, capable of running estates in their husband's absence, overseeing servants, and even influencing local politics through networks of kinship. Your mainstream historical fact. In many noble households, women wielded significant power behind the scenes, managing finances, arranging marriages for their children, and maintaining alliances. Obedience was a social expectation, but not the whole story. You imagine the daily rhythms of married life, the early mornings filled with chores, the evenings spent planning for harvest or feasts, the quiet negotiations over money and favors. Love might bloom within these bounds, but it often had to navigate layers of duty and tradition. Your quirky tidbit. Some medieval households had wise women or matrons who acted as advisors to younger wives, passing down secrets of managing both hearth and heart. As dusk deepens, you picture the bride from earlier, now a wife, settling into her new role. The wedding day's bright promise blends into the steady cadence of years, shaped by shared toil and occasional tenderness. Historians debate whether medieval marriage was more about partnership or patriarchy, but you sense it was a dynamic dance, complex, negotiated, and deeply human. You breathe in the cool evening air and continue walking, carrying the whispered stories of love and labor woven through the fabric of medieval life. You find yourself drawn into the shadowed corners of a village tavern where stories of love and betrayal swirl around the firelight like smoke. Among the gathered crowd, whispered tales of infidelity and scandal ripple through the air, laced with laughter and judgment. It seems even in medieval times, marriage was no guarantee against wandering hearts or broken promises. You overhear a hushed account of a lord who was rumored to keep a mistress in a nearby town, much to his wife's chagrin. Another tale speaks of a merchant's wife whose secret liaisons almost led to public disgrace. Your mainstream historical fact. Adultery was considered a serious offense, often punished by fines, social ostracism, or worse. But enforcement varied widely by region and social class. Noble affairs might be overlooked or quietly managed, while common folk faced harsher scrutiny. A woman with sharp eyes leans forward, recounting how her cousin caught her husband with another woman, leading to a bitter public dispute that tore the family apart. The crowd listens, some nodding sympathetically, others smirking at the familiar drama. Your quirky tidbit. Some communities held love courts, informal gatherings where grievances about infidelity were aired and resolved, sometimes with humor, sometimes with harsh penalties. Despite the gossip, you sense an unspoken rule. Marriage was both a private bond and a public contract. Betrayals threatened not only personal relationships, but the social order itself. Historians still debate how common infidelity was and how it shaped medieval family life. What's clear is that love and loyalty were as complicated then as they are now. As the fire burns low, the tavern's chatter drifts toward lighter subjects, jokes, and plans for the next festival. You step back into the night, the stories of passion and betrayal weaving into the tapestry of medieval life you've been tracing all along. You leave the tavern's warmth behind and stroll toward the village crossroads, where a handful of travelers have gathered to rest. Among them is a storyteller, a slender man with bright eyes and a quick smile, who begins weaving a tale of love, loss, and reconciliation. His story is one you've heard variations of before: noblewoman betrothed against her will, a forbidden romance with a commoner, and a secret wedding beneath the moonlight. The crowd leans in as he describes the challenges they faced: disapproval, danger, and the relentless pull of fate. Your mainstream historical fact: romantic love as a basis for marriage was a relatively new concept in medieval Europe, gaining prominence through courtly love, literature, and troubadour songs, even as most marriages remained arranged for political or economic reasons. The storyteller's voice rises and falls, painting vivid scenes of stolen glances, whispered promises, and daring escapes. His listeners are captivated, caught between skepticism and longing. Your quirky tidbit: some medieval tales speak of love tokens, locks of hair, embroidered handkerchiefs, or carved wooden hearts exchanged as symbols of devotion, sometimes becoming family heirlooms passed down through generations. As the story unfolds, you feel the tension between duty and desire playing out against the backdrop of rigid social norms. The lover's struggles echo the broader human quest for connection and freedom. Historians still debate how much influence courtly love had on real marriages, but its ideals undoubtedly shaped the cultural imagination. The storyteller finishes with a sigh, leaving the crowd thoughtful and silent. You step away, carrying the echoes of his tale into the fading light, a reminder that beneath the contracts and customs lies the enduring heart of human experience. You wander toward the village edge as twilight deepens, where the last of the wedding guests are departing, their laughter mingling with the rustling leaves. A group of younger villagers gathers around a freshly built wooden arch, decorated with ribbons and wildflowers. They're preparing for a communal celebration, a mix of old customs and new ideas. You overhear talk of hand-fasting ceremonies becoming more symbolic, of couples choosing their own vows, and even of modest feasts that welcome not only kin but the broader community. Your mainstream historical fact: by the late Middle Ages, the strict formalities of marriage began to relax in some regions. One young woman speaks excitedly about her hope to marry for love, not just duty, sparking both smiles and raised eyebrows among her friends. A young man nods thoughtfully, admitting that he's eager to break with tradition, but unsure how his family will react. Your quirky tidbit: in some villages, newlyweds started to incorporate personal tokens, handwritten poems, homemade gifts, even small dances that were previously considered frivolous, but now gained acceptance as expressions of affection. As the evening shadows lengthen, you sense the slow but steady transformation of marriage customs, blending ancient rites with emerging ideals. Historians still debate how widespread these changes were and whether they foreshadowed modern marriage or simply represented local variations. You pause beneath the arch, imagining the lives of those who will marry here, lives shaped by both history and hope. The village settles into quiet as stars emerge overhead, and you carry the promise of change into the night. You walk through the village under a sky dusted with stars, the soft hum of evening settling like a blanket. The day's celebrations have ended, and the world feels hushed, as if holding its breath after the whirlwind of rituals, feasts, and promises. Your thoughts turn to the threads connecting past and present, the echoes of medieval weddings woven into the fabric of today's ceremonies. The rings exchanged, the music played, the vows spoken aloud in front of witnesses. Traditions that have survived centuries, shaped by time, but never fully erased. You imagine the bride and groom from that ancient stone chapel, their hands trembling as they vowed loyalty. The noble couple dining beneath banners and gilded plates, the peasant bride dancing barefoot on the earthen floor. Their stories ripple outward, carried forward by generations who adapted customs to new worlds and new loves. Your mainstream historical fact. Many modern wedding customs, from wearing white, though their meanings have shifted with the tides of culture and fashion. A warm breeze stirs the leaves as you recall the small charms tucked into sleeves, the tokens buried beneath hearthstones, the songs sung under moonlight. These were not mere superstitions, but acts of hope, a yearning to make the fragile promise of marriage endure. Your quirky tidbit, the tying of the knot, likely began as a literal hand-fasting ritual, a physical binding symbolizing union, which has since evolved into a metaphor embraced around the world. As you pause beneath a spreading oak, the night sounds wrap around you, a distant owl, the soft rustle of grass, the murmur of voices fading into sleep. You feel a deep calm settle in your chest, a gentle reminder that beneath all the history, weddings are celebrations of connection, resilience, and love. Historians may debate the details, but the human heart has always sought to mark these moments with meaning, ritual, and joy. And tonight, as the village sleeps, you carry their stories with you, quiet, enduring, and full of promise. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.